Hey everybody, it's Mark from Ripple Training. So for the past 6 years, I've been the lead editor for the annual Bioneers Conference. This is kind of like a series of TED Talk style presentations. It happens every year. It's been going on for 30 years now here in Marin County at a 4,000 seat venue in the San Rafael Civic Center. It's a 3-camera shoot for these presentations, but if you add in the graphics feed and the switched show, as well as the 2 GoPro cameras that are stage mounted, you end up with 7 angles. So we have a 7-angle multicam project. Each day is 4 hours, so it's a 4-hour long timeline with 7 angles. And our job is to turn these around as quickly as possible. We clean up the live show, we change the angles, we choose the best shots, we tighten things up, we add graphics, we break them into segments, and do a full QA pass and everything, clean up the audio, etc. Over the past 6 years, I've really learned a lot about how to work more efficiently with multicam projects in Final Cut Pro 10. So today I thought I'd share with you 10 very quick tips on how you can work more efficiently with multicam projects in Final Cut Pro 10. So let's dive right in. Tip number 1, choose the right codec and size and type of storage. In order to be able to edit multicam projects in real time, you need to choose a resolution, codec, storage solution, and connection type that will maximize playback performance. For this project, we had the camera operators record 1080 HD to ProRes LT, since it's visually identical to ProRes at a significantly lower data rate, and the all-interframe codec is very edit-friendly. Our primary storage devices were a Promise RAID and a G-Speed RAID, each with the default RAID 5 configuration, which offers high data rate coupled with data protection, since if one drive fails, you can still rebuild the RAID with a new drive and not lose data. These drives connected over Thunderbolt to the iMac Pros pictured here allowed us to play back all 7 angles in full resolution without ever dropping a frame. Tip number 2, set up a folder structure on the RAID. Creating a logical folder structure on your storage device and then importing folders as keyword collections will make it much easier to locate specific camera angles, presenter materials, graphics, and other assets. Tip number 3, set up your libraries properly. Setting up your libraries correctly up front will really save you down the road. First of all, for this project, we created a separate library for each day because each day was a very large 4-hour timeline. And by keeping separate libraries, it was easier to transfer them back and forth because we had multiple editors in multiple locations. And if for some reason a library became corrupt or something, it was just one day, it wasn't everything. Next, in Preferences, under Playback, I make sure that Create Optimized Media for Multicam Clips is unchecked. This is checked by default. Frequently, it's not what you want because it will automatically create optimized media for every piece of media that's been put in a multicam clip. In our case, we shot up front with ProRes LT, no reason for optimized media whatsoever. So for many projects, the best thing to do is to uncheck this. On the Import tab, I choose Leave in Place because we already have copied all of our media to the RAID and we don't need to make another copy of it. In the Library Inspector, for library properties, I set the motion content to be in the library. The default is the motion templates folder. But by keeping the motion content in the library, any custom motion templates that you use, and we use several in this project, get contained within the library. So when we send that library back and forth between editors or to our producer, those templates will come with it, and we don't need to instruct anybody on how to install motion templates into the motion templates folder. I set the cache location outside of the library, usually directly on the computer's internal SSD for speed. This helps keep the library very small for transfers and makes the cache very fast as it's running off an SSD. Finally, I make a library-level smart collection that includes all projects but no snapshots at all. We regularly back up our projects by creating snapshots, but we don't want to see them. And by creating this smart collection, we just see our currently active projects. Tip number 4, create multicam clips quickly. First, it's critical to name your angles before creating your multicam clip, especially if the cameras were turned on and off during recording. In our case, each of the 3 main cameras were turned off during a break. So the presentations ran from 9 a.m. to 1 p.m., but there was about a half-hour break in between. So for instance, we see here Saturday, camera 1, Part 1 and Saturday Camera 1 Part 2. Those both need the same name in order to be included in the same angle. If I select one and we go to the Info Inspector here, we can see that the camera name is set to Cam 1. If I go down here to Camera 2, it's set to Camera 2. If I switch this view from Basic to General, you'll see there's also an option for a camera angle. You can name the camera in the camera angle field or the camera name field. It doesn't matter. The key is to name all the clips from the same camera with the same camera name or camera angle. You saw Cam 1 and Cam 2. Here's Camera 3. And then we had the graphics camera, in other words, the monitor showing all the graphics. And we had what's called the program camera, and that was the switched show that was captured. So those are our 5 separate angles, each with a separate camera name. We added the GoPro clips later. I'll talk about that in a moment. So now that those are all named, if I select them all, right-click, and choose New Multicam Clip, I can choose Custom Settings, and then under Angle Assembly, I'll choose Camera Name because that's the field I use to identify them. Very key. If you use camera angle, you'd select this. I'll choose camera name. My second tip is about synchronization. A lot of folks don't have time code, they don't slate their takes at all, and they just use audio for synchronization. And that's great. Final Cut Pro's audio synchronization works great, but it takes time. In this case, we have time code synced cameras. We don't need to use audio. If I left this turned on and clicked OK, Final Cut would attempt to analyze these 4-hour-long clips, actually 2 hours plus 2 hours, but they would attempt to analyze it to match up the waveforms, and it would take a really long time. No need for that here. So if you do have timecode sync, or you had a clapper, a slate, or somebody clapped their hands, or some kind of sync reference point, and you have long clips, you might want to skip the audio synchronization because it can take a while in longer clips. The other tip I have for you here is even if you don't have any sync points at all, if you throw a marker in to each angle, including the audio, if you have separate dual system audio, throw a marker in close to a sync point. When you use audio synchronization, it will look around that marker first and can significantly speed up the time it takes to create that multicam clip. In our case, we don't need it at all because we can set our angle synchronization to time code, which I'll do right now. And if I click OK, our multicam clip gets created instantaneously. I'll double click it to open it, and we can see here, a little bit big by default. I'll press Shift Command minus a few times to make them smaller. And there we can see our 5 camera angles, each one with 2 separate clips, and there's our gap in the middle for the break, and everything is in perfect sync. Tip number 5, leverage rolls for audio to quickly identify channels. So I have my multicam clip selected here in the browser. And you can see in the multicam viewer here that I'm set up for video only editing, and I have selected my program. The reason for this is because each of these cameras were receiving audio, but we only used audio from the program angle. The program is the switched show that was being recorded. If we look over in the audio inspector at our audio configuration, remember this is for the entire multicam clip, we could enable audio for any one of these different angles. Each of these different cameras had audio and you could turn them on. We just used program, and in fact we only used some of the program source. And I set this up before creating before starting to edit the multicam clip. I created custom roles and gave them color codes so it's easy to identify the audio source. So one source was the house mix, which represented the kind of mix from the stage. Then we have the audience audio, which is our mics pointed at the audience. The Andy mix is Andy in the production truck was doing a mix on the fly, mixing in audience and on stage, and that was very good. We used that most of the time. And then we had 2 empty channels here altogether. So you can see I have the Andy mix selected and the other one's turned off because that was set up by default. I set up these roles. If we click on Edit Roles, you can see here where I've created these additional roles and set colors for them. This makes it very easy to identify the source of the audio in the timeline. And you can see my timeline here, it all has this orange color, which means we're using the Andy mix. At any time that I wanted to, for any particular segment, if I move down here in the timeline now, for this particular portion of the multicam clip, if I select it, at that time, I can, of course, switch to any of these audio sources. I can expand it here in the timeline, or I can select it right here in the inspector. So by setting up custom color-coded audio roles, it makes it really easy at a glance to tell exactly what the audio source is. Tip number 6, optimize GoPro selects. So GoPro footage is recorded in a compressed H.264 format. It's not very edit friendly, especially in multicam. And if you're trying to play back 7 angles of multicam like we're doing here, your computer may likely choke on that GoPro footage. So you might think to optimize it. In other words, turn on optimizing for multicam clips or manually optimize. However, there's so much GoPro footage because the cameras were running continuously that literally, we've done this before, it would take overnight to optimize that GoPro footage and create a huge amount of data. And we were trying to carefully manage our data to keep it under about 6 terabytes. And the GoPro footage would end up creating like a terabyte of data. So what we found is we would first identify where we wanted to use that GoPro footage. Usually specifically in some dance performances, we wouldn't use it for any kind of single person presentation, and we would just take those clips, we would trim them, take those clips, and then export ProRes. So we didn't optimize, but we actually just exported from Final Cut ProRes versions of those GoPro selects, and then imported those and put them into our multicam edit. So we didn't bother with the rest of it. The second part of this is the GoPro footage, the audio on the GoPro clips is very bad, and they need to be synced manually. And if you're trying to sync lots of GoPro clips, it can take a long time to do that, especially if they're from a distant vantage point. They have a wide angle and it can be hard to find something to sync to. It's kind of a pain in the neck. So what you can see we've done here in the angle editor, we've only included a few GoPro clips. In fact, this is the center GoPro camera that has about, 8 clips. And the left-hand one only has a couple because it didn't record anything useful in the first part, so we just didn't bother optimizing it. Why optimize all that media that you'll never ever use? So we tried to get upfront about being specific about our selects and just optimized the clips that we might use when we're cutting the multicam, and that cut down way down on the amount of time for optimizing, the amount of space taken up, and when we're editing and choosing which angle to cut to, we don't even need to think about the GoPro angles. In fact, when you have your multicam clip, multicam viewer open, you can set it to a fewer number of angles so you don't have to look at the GoPro clips, and that will improve playback performance. Tip number 7, use progressive disclosure. Progressive disclosure simply means showing just the things that you need available to you for the current task. And there's 2 reasons for it. One is real estate and the other is performance. So for example, here I've got my browser open, I have the angle viewer open, I've got my viewer, my inspector, and my timeline. If I'm cutting, if I'm in the process of editing and making selects, I definitely need my angle viewer. I probably don't need my inspector right now. Command 4, I can close that. And then I really don't need either the sidebar or the browser. So Command and the tilde key would hide the sidebar, or Control Command 1 will hide the entire browser. I'm not interested in that right now. I'm done with the process of reviewing footage, making keywords, creating favorites, creating the multicam clip, setting all that up. I can get rid of it and focus on the task at hand. And now I have really decent screen real estate for the things that are important to me. The angles, so if on a particular part and I don't want an audience shot here, it's easy for me to cut to something else. If I hold the Option key down, I can switch that angle rather than cutting it. And then I can go through and do my edits and tweak everything as I'm working. The other thing is, for performance purposes, there's a couple things you can do. For example, if I'm not really interested in audio right now, I'm really focused on the visuals, I'm not adjusting audio, I could turn off the waveforms down here, go to my clip appearance and select a clip appearance that does not include the waveforms. And that will significantly speed up performance because Final Cut doesn't need to redraw those waveforms as it's working. Finally, if I'm really familiar with my angles, and you can see I've set them up intentionally so that the first angle is camera 1, the second angle is camera 2, camera 3. And by the way to deal with that is if I double click on any clip to open up the angle editor, you can change the order of your angles by dragging these little hand grabbers here, and you can switch the angle. And when you do, that switch will be updated here in the angle viewer. So let's go back to our project. But I know 1 is camera 1, 2 is camera 2, 3 is camera 3, graphics is 4, program is 5. And I'm not editing something here where I care about the GoPros. There are no GoPros for this particular talk, let's say, and it's a half-hour talk. So if I have performance problems, for instance, I have now moved my project from the on-site edit suite where we're working with iMac Pros, and I'm working at home still on a RAID but connected to a laptop, and maybe I can't play everything back in real time. Well, guess what? Shift Command 7, I can close the angle viewer completely, and if I don't need to see it, that's the assumption. So on this shot, I could press Option 1 for camera 1, Option 2 for camera 2, Option 3 for camera 3, our audience shot, Option 4 for the graphics or what's being shown on the screen at that time, and Option 5 is the same thing in this case. So I can just toggle those by tapping the keyboard, and I'm going to get much better performance because Final Cut isn't forced to play back all streams at the same time. It's playing a single stream. Tip number 8, use adjustment layers for chapter markers. So if I go to my timeline index and select tags and then select chapter markers right here, you can see we have chapter markers that we've used to identify the different sections in this 4-hour timeline. And the numbers represent specific sections to create when exporting, so we can export separate speakers. And if we click on any one of those, we'll jump to that chapter marker. The reason for using these chapter markers, if I go to a version that's been exported already, in the QuickTime movie that gets exported, if you click this little icon here, it will show you all of the chapter markers and allow you to jump to that specific chapter marker. So you can see that specific talk just by clicking on it. And you can jump to that. So they're super useful even if you're not making DVDs. So here's the thing though, if I zoom in close here, Command plus a few times, you'll see that this chapter marker isn't sitting on the video, or in this case a title card, but it's sitting on an adjustment layer. An adjustment layer is just an empty title layer. This RT adjustment layer is actually part of our Ripple Tools Complete. You can see here adjustment layer, but you can also make them yourself with motion. So short ad for Ripple Tools Complete. You can check that at rippletraining.com. Now, the reason that we place these chapter markers on an adjustment layer instead of on the video clip themselves is because it makes them much more flexible. On the video clip, if I tap MM and then choose a chapter marker, and then I want to change that chapter marker, I can't move it. I can change the poster frame by moving this little doodad right here that will choose what gets shown up in the chapter. So maybe I'd want to see the person instead of this title card, but I can't move that chapter marker. And usually these have a long name. You can see all the names here, and you'd have to basically copy this, delete it, and create a new one. If you place the chapter marker on an adjustment layer, it's easy to move that chapter marker anywhere, and we find that we frequently need to move these because we drop them in on the rough cut, and then as we tweak and cut things down and clean things up, tighten things up, we need to move these chapter markers frequently until we settle in on where they belong, and having them on an adjustment layer makes that really easy to do. Tip number 9, make super fast lower thirds. So this tip isn't specific to multicam workflow, but it's a great way to do something very quickly. We need to add lower thirds to these projects. As I've mentioned, they're 4 hours long. There's 3 days of them. Each one has maybe 10 or 12 separate presentations, which may have an introductory speaker and then the speaker. So we may be adding 30 or 40 or 50 lower thirds to each day. We need a way of doing it quickly. Here is one example. The lower third is a simple PNG file with transparency, and it's animated with 2 transitions. So it just simply wipes on and fades off. It has a very specific duration and a specific position when it needs to go in. Now, once you've made it once, you don't need to make it again. So what I'm going to do is select it by selecting the shelf, Command-C to copy it, and then I'll go to the next speaker, and let's say I want to put him in right here. I'll just press Command-V to paste it, and then I just need to replace the content. Because I imported my folder of lower thirds, because I named my folders, if you see the earlier tip, I have a keyword collection for my lower thirds. It's organized alphabetically, so I can find the person, Bill McKibben. I'll select it here, and notice the active clip indicator, the little round ball there, tells me that this clip will be selected. So if I do a replace edit with Option R, that will immediately swap out the content, and that lower third is done. And that can really reduce the time of doing lower thirds from something that could take literally several hours. You can do an entire day or 30 or 40 of these in about maybe half an hour. They each need to position correctly. You need to play them back and make sure that they aren't over a cut point or something else that happens to the camera. So there's a few things you need to check out, but you can get them in place extremely quickly by doing a simple copy, paste, and replace edit. Tip number 10, make super fast audio adjustments. So audio editing is a huge part of any video project to really make it come together. It's extremely important. We spent a lot of time on it in these 4-hour timelines, making sure the audio is level between speakers with applause versus the speakers themselves, having clean audio transitions from one speaker to another. And there's a lot of fiddling around that needs to be done with audio. One thing has to do with audio fades. Usually you have to grab these little fade handles and drag them, which is difficult to locate and do that, especially if you're doing it a lot. If you select a clip, you may have noticed that under the Modify menu, under just Volume, there's several commands for applying and removing fades and toggling fades on either side of a clip, but there's no keyboard shortcuts. If I go to Final Cut Pro Commands Customize or Option Command K, and type the word fade in the search box, we'll see all of those commands right here and no keyboard shortcuts. However, you can assign them. In fact, I have here a editing set where I've already applied them. If you want to know more about this, I cover it in detail in the Warp Speed editing tutorial at rippletraining.com. But the gist of it here is I've applied keyboard shortcuts. So now, instead, if I have a clip selected, and a fast way to select a clip, by the way, if you hold the Command key and press the down arrow, it'll move down through those to select that clip. And then in this case, to apply it, just Option Command F will apply that fade. If I have the Control key, it'll get rid of it. And you might wonder about the duration. Well, if we hit Command comma to go to Preferences, in the Editing tab of Preferences, you can set the audio fade duration, which I've bumped up from the default ½ second to a second here. So Option Command F will fade both sides at once. And then from there, if I want, I can right-click and select a different fade type. If I just want to fade in, for instance, here, I just want to fade in, well, I've got a keyboard shortcut for that. So Control Command F will just fade in. And if I hold the same keys down, it'll toggle that on and off. But I can quickly do a fade in, and then I may need to adjust the timing, but at least it gets that little ball out there where it's much easier to select. And then I can also choose how I want to do that fade in. It might work a little better here to scoop it like that for this particular type of audience reaction sound coming in. So one more tip on the audio is if I zoom out a little bit, and you need to adjust an entire section. So I may have one speaker between these two chapter markers represents one speaker, that the entire speaker, the entire section is low. Maybe the speaker speaks a little softer or they adjusted the audio. Well, if I select the whole thing and I go to the audio inspector just to see it here, if I press the Control key and press minus or plus, it will add or subtract 1 decibel at a time to that audio. We're not seeing anything here because the audio has different levels selected for each of these and we have keyframes. But if I press Control plus a few times, you probably see in the timeline that the audio is bumping up overall. So it can be a quick way without needing to do a compound clip or move to rolls and do a sort of subcomponent roll-based thing in compound clips, but just select the clips, Control plus or minus, can bump all the audio up or down in a section. So if you found this information useful, you might want to check out our Multicam editing in Final Cut Pro 10 tutorial, which you can see here. I'll put a link in the description field. Check that out. Subscribe, like the video if you liked it, and we'll see you next time here on MacBreak Studio.